Hey guys, it's Dani. Welcome to another episode of our Care Tips for Beginners series. Today we're going to talk all about staking and stabilizing our orchids beyond the aesthetic side of things and going into the actual health and protection of our orchids. So I'm going to show you a few techniques in which you can actually stabilize your orchid through stakes and other means, and why it is actually important and very beneficial for them to do so. We are of course going to talk about staking flower spikes as well. Aesthetics are of course an important part of this hobby, but we will focus on the health aspect. Today's episode, along with our entire Orchid Care for Beginners series, is sponsored by repotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchid, from media to fertilizer, pots, and all sorts of accessories. Some of the accessories that I will use in this care series and in today's video are provided by RepotMe, so I will link you to their website down below in the description. Feel free to visit them at any time. So with that said, let's start with the flower spikes, because typically when we're thinking about staking an orchid, we are thinking about the flower spike. So many of the accessories we use are made specifically for this purpose. Okay, so if you've ever purchased a typical Phalaenopsis orchid from the flower shop, you might have noticed that the vast majority of them, if not all of them, have their flower spikes attached to a wooden type of stake. And this practice actually has two reasons behind it. One of them is to train the flower spike to grow as much as possible upright and then arch in order to create a good display. But also, through this technique, orchids take less space on transport, so it is much more economical for the business in general. Normally, a Phalaenopsis orchid which is not staked will produce pendant flower spikes. The spikes will actually grow downwards or at an angle, and due to the heaviness of the flowers, they will end up just growing downwards. As you can imagine, if this happens, the orchids will not be efficient in the way they consume space, but also the flowers can be at risk of getting damaged before they even make the flower shops or garden centers. So for orchid nurseries, it is very important to stake flower spikes in order to protect the flowers. But in home applications, this has a health aspect as well. You see, the Phalaenopsis we typically find in flower shops and garden centers are hybrids. Many of their parents, which are species, don't actually produce those long flower spikes full of flowers. And here I actually have a species. And can we see how short the flower spike is? Also, this orchid does not produce massive flowers, and it doesn't actually open too many flowers at one time. And this is typical for this type of species. And in this case, not staking the flower spike poses absolutely no risk to the orchid. The longer a flower spike is, the more prone it is to getting snagged on your clothes. Maybe pets want to play with it, thinking it's a toy. Typically, the shorter the flower spike and smaller the flowers, the more protected the entire orchid will be. So in this case, we don't actually need to stake anything. But since the vast majority of people do prefer long and arching flower spikes, the hybridizers' efforts were concentrated into obtaining these type of hybrids. The downfall is their flower spikes are so heavy and so long sometimes that they can totally tip over the orchid. So as you can imagine, in your home, if the orchid is on a high shelf, under the weight of the flowers, the orchid can fall on the ground and not only break its flower spike, which would not be such a bad thing, but also break its leaves and its roots. And that directly impacts its health. You don't want to lose leaves or roots from your Phalaenopsis orchid. And such as the Phalaenopsis are many other types of orchids in cultivation. It is just safer for them and better for us sometimes to keep their flower spikes staked. It doesn't actually mean we have to stake their flower spikes. If we can make sure they are safe where they are having flower spikes just pendant, that's perfectly fine. But since not all of us have the same conditions at home, in cultivation, we use all sorts of wooden and bamboo stakes in order to secure these flower spikes. Some of these stakes can be green to better blend with the foliage. Other times they're straight up bamboo skewers. These are a good option, but they do degrade quite fast. The wetter they stay, the faster they degrade, so it's not a permanent solution. Some stakes are metal and they're coated with a plastic layer, so they don't actually degrade and can be reused multiple times. And the list can go on. I see all sorts of stakes coming out on the market lately, and they're all perfectly good. So as you can see, without a stake, this Paphiopedilum orchid is actually pretty exposed to the home elements. And if we're not careful and happen to bump into it, this flower spike is the first one to go. All we have to do is insert the stake into the pot. And if you can actually see through the pot, that would be ideal. Go close to the flower spike and then secure it to the stake. And all of a sudden, our flower spike doesn't actually lean as much, and it's not so awkward to be around. When it comes to Phalaenopsis orchids, flower spikes actually need a little bit of training as they grow. And I do talk about it in a different video, which I will add down below in the description. I explain all of the steps, but in the beginning, the flower spikes are really tender. So it's not a good idea to use these stakes from the very beginning. But as the flower spike matures, it is completely hardened off. So we can actually place a stake near it and use one of these really pretty stakes to stabilize it. Now, these types of clips are super popular with orchids. And with Phalaenopsis, they work great after the flower spike is completely hardened off. But sometimes we might want to stake other types of flower spikes or even pseudobulbs, as I will show you a little later. And the fact that this stake kind of grabs a lot onto the flower spike, it could potentially damage some more tender flower spikes. So for those types of spikes, I actually prefer these clips, which are also from Repot Me, and I'll show you what makes these great. So taking a look inside this little clip, we can see that we have two little pieces of plastic right here where the middle hinge sits. Well, if we manage to place them really close to the stake, what they will do is close around the stake, but actually make the hook not close all the way and create this little gap here through which a tender flower spike or stem can fit. So without the stake, you can see how much the clip closes, but with the stake, the gap here is much wider. So in case you're working with a very thin stem or a tender stem, I believe these are just a little bit better because we can clip them like so. The stem has space to move around. It is not actually pinched at all, and it's much safer for the stem. As I was saying, with Phalaenopsis, it's not all that important because they do have sturdy flower spikes. But with orchids such as Oncidium types, Miltoniopsis, such as this orchid, we can see that the stem is a lot more tender and sensitive. So if we wish to stake it, I would definitely go for these types of clips. So this is the first type of use for these flower spikes. As I was saying, the most popular use. There is absolutely no trouble if you leave the flower spikes unstaked, and you can make sure that you're not going to bump over the orchid. But in many cases, you can actually find benefits in various ways of staking your orchid. But now let's talk about staking other parts of your orchid in order to make a super huge impact on its health. One thing all orchids love is stability. This is because naturally they are always very stable in their environment due to the strong roots they have that anchor them to the trees or rocks or whatever they grow in their natural habitat. As you might know, in cultivation, we cannot really play by the same rules, and sometimes we need to repot our orchids. Sometimes we can even deal with orchids that somehow remain rootless. And I do have a video for you guys down below in the description. If you've ever had a Phalaenopsis which is almost completely rootless, do check that video out. I do show you how I go about saving and rejuvenating these types of orchids. But as you can imagine, a sick orchid which suffered from root rot will not be stable because it will have no root to actually anchor it to the pot and to the medium. And those types of orchids absolutely need anchoring. Not only do rootless orchids have issues sitting upright in the pot in the way that we typically cultivate them, but the bigger issue is that when roots finally start to grow, if the orchid is very wobbly in its pot, they are in danger of actually being damaged by the medium around them. And this is a very, very big issue with orchids which don't have roots. We need these new roots to grow unbothered in an environment which is as stable as possible. With some orchids, we might not actually have a second chance. And particularly if we have to move our orchid to the sink or to another place to water it, these new root tips are very, very vulnerable. So as you can see, my orchid does have a stake. I stabilized it at some point, because in the past, it really didn't have a good root system. Now it does. As we can see, I have a lot of roots in the pot and my orchid is very stable, so I can completely remove this stake. But in the beginning, if I have a wobbly orchid, I like to stake it and stabilize it, and I'll show you how I go about that. So here I have an orchid that I just repotted, and as we can see, it is extremely wobbly in its pot. And this is because it doesn't actually have a good root system. This is a perfect candidate for being staked. So my orchid has a new growth just developing here, and also 2 older pseudobulbs which are completely mature. Typically, I never stake the new growth, which is still going through changes, unless I have no other choice. But in this case, I do. So what I will do is use this older pseudobulb, which I know will not change its shape, and get a stake. This is a bamboo stake, but obviously any stake will do. I will place it close to the pseudobulb, and then I like to tie the very top of the pseudobulb to the stake. Because even though this is an old growth, it is completely mature and it's not going to change much. Can we see that my orchid is a little bit dehydrated? Well, when the new roots will grow, this pseudobulb will start to plump up. So if I tie it here, what will happen is I will create a line on the pseudobulb where I tie it. I will squeeze it and the shape will look pretty bad. So I prefer to stake it here where the leaf starts to grow. And since these clips are just too tiny for that and they will just pinch into the pseudobulb or the leaf, I like to use a tie of sorts. I have here a metal wire, but of course you can use a piece of string or other materials which you can make sure will not pinch into the structure. So I'm just gonna tie this. It's not all that important to make it super pretty because this is temporary. It's just going to take a few months until new roots grow. And here we go, my orchid is a lot more stable. It still needs protection, so I will try to be careful around it, but at least it's not in danger of completely jumping out of her pot. Here I have a dendrobium orchid which has very tall canes. They tend to get a little top heavy and the root system is simply not developed enough yet. When I untie the canes, you can see they tend to wobble quite a bit and make the entire orchid unstable. In this case, since the pseudobulbs are cane-like and pretty thin, I am actually using these types of clips that I showed you earlier, and rather than placing it like this and pinching the actual pseudobulb, I like to pinch the stake with these 2 plastic bits here and pretty much keep the cane loose inside. So if I ever decide to remove these stakes, I will not have pinch lines. It's the same on this side as well. We can see how wobbly this cane is, but I stabilize it really efficiently with these clips and these bamboo skewers. As a side note, if you prefer your orchid to be tidy and not take up a lot of space, you can actually leave these on. Because the clips don't restrict the sap flow in any way, you can actually leave them on permanently if you don't mind the look. So up until now, we looked at oncidiums and dendrobiums and all sorts of orchids that actually have tall structures that are easy to stake. But what can we do in the case of a Phalaenopsis, which is a monopodial and doesn't have pseudobulbs or canes? Well, there are 2 ways in which I go about it, or actually 3 if I think about it. So first of all, what I like to do is use the flower spike as a stake. If your orchid is sick, I would completely remove any possibility of the flower spike flowering. And in my case, even though I don't have a sick orchid, I'm pretty much done with the flowers. I would like to leave this orchid focused on vegetative growth. I will go ahead and cut it right here. I want to leave enough of the stake that I can actually pin it to something, but not enough to encourage the possibility of a rebloom. Reblooms can happen from the very tip of the flower spike or from one of the nodes below it. And even though I do still have a viable node here, if I see it starting to swell, I can just remove it. In this case, I prefer to focus on the health and recovery of the orchid, on roots and leaves rather than flowers. So at this stage, it's really easy for me to just insert a stake next to the flower spike and just pin the flower spike to that stake. The spike might start to dry out, it's okay. Let it be, it's not actually going to detach from the orchid, it will still anchor it. And when the orchid will be stable and it will have roots, you can completely remove the dried flower spike. So this is technique number 1. But what do we do if we don't actually have a flower spike to help us out? So I'm gonna make this flower spike disappear. Option number 1 is to place a stake very, very close to its stem or axis, and then again use a tie of sorts to tie the axis to the stake. I usually like to go pretty low because the stem is a little bit more tender towards the top and a little tougher towards the root system. So sometimes this can actually stabilize the orchid enough until it produces roots, or in cases in which the stem is not long enough or it's just very tender depending on the orchid, what I do is split this stake in half and I insert one on one side of the stem and the other on the other side, like so. So in this way, I can actually keep the orchid from wobbling simply by restricting its movement on this angle. Typically, Phalaenopsis will wiggle back and forth if you want to think of the orchid in this manner. So this is another good way of stabilizing it. And of course, when the root system is grown, you can remove these stakes and the orchid should be just fine. And since you saw me remove the flower spike from this orchid, I will share with you down below in the description one of the episodes of our series in which I talk all about removing the flower spike, aftercare for Phalaenopsis orchids after the flowers drop, because I'm sure you have some questions right now, and I'm just assured that that video will answer those questions. As far as I'm concerned, I don't want any flowers from this orchid anymore. I want it to grow leaves and roots, and as a grower, I typically prefer brand new flower spikes from my Phalaenopsis rather than secondary spikes. And as a final idea before I let you go, you can actually keep your orchid staked or supported, maybe through a ring support or other means, pretty much indefinitely. Stakes don't actually harm anything. They keep orchids tidier, and in certain homes and environments, that might be a very good thing and very useful thing for the orchid, but it is equally as fine to just keep your orchid free of stakes, let it go pendant, let it grow wherever it wants to grow. It's absolutely fine as long as you are mindful around it and make sure you are not going to damage the leaves or the root system. So with that said, I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Hope you found it useful, and whenever you will deal with a rootless orchid, hopefully now you know how to stabilize it. So thank you Repot.me for sponsoring this video together with this entire series. Subscribe to my channel for more orchid videos, tutorials, experiments, updates, and other fun orchid subjects. If you wish to support the channel, do consider becoming a member or visit the merch store linked down below in the description. You can also follow me on Instagram and Facebook. It's always nice to stay in touch there as well. And with that said, I'll see you guys next time. Bye!